Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking about some vocals and how you can use them in interesting ways. Because we probably all know about the trick of just placing vocals in the track and using them to really tell the story. But you don't have to use vocals this way, because here I have two examples of where I'm actually chopping them up so that you really cannot recognize what the vocal is saying, and then using them as either a sequence or a one-shot. So the way that this works is it's based all around the drum rack, as well as the spectral resonator in this case, because we're using the spectral resonator for the tuning. And of course, the drum rack is used to trigger all of the slices of vocals that we're going to use. So of course, you can go in different vocals and manually chop out different areas, but as you can see, this is just one vocal that's sliced into pieces, which is very easy to do because you can just go onto any vocal, right-click, and then slice the new MIDI track. Here, what I personally like to do is either set it to transient, if I really want to capture all of the blackiness out of a sound, or I'll set it to 1/8 or 1/16 notes if I have a certain idea of how long the slices are going to be. And I really want to have something a little bit more glitchy, because it's not necessarily going to slice around the areas that make sense within the vocal itself. If you use transient modes, it kind of tends to cut around each of the individual syllables that you see in the vocal. So this thing, this little area, this little area, this little area. All of those become one slice, and therefore you can really naturally chop up the vocal. You just take one of these unsynchronized vocals over here and you just chop them up into little areas like this, based on the beat length, as opposed to actually where the syllables land inside of the vocal. So you right-click, slice here, and in this case, let's go for the transient mode. And then you'll get a file that looks somewhat like this, and it's just going to play back the exact same vocal that we had before.
At a critical time when young people must make decisions that will shape their future, the people who become dependent upon marijuana are dependent on an escape that makes the unreal seem beautiful and the reality of life seem unnecessary.
Well, most of you will probably not believe me when I say that it picked that at random, those vocals, but I think it's a message. So you can imagine that this isn't really useful, just having the vocal chopped up like this. We really need to trigger these kind of randomly. And in order to do that, what I recommend is that you have a file like this just somewhere stored away, which is this full MIDI for random 4 bars over here. This is just nothing more than an individual clip that I can load up and comes with all of the notes preloaded. And as you can see in this case, we have 82 slices over here. And then we also have a bunch of notes that aren't used within the actual slices, but that are still full here. So those, when they're actually triggered in some way, are going to be completely silent, because of course there's no audio loaded on those pads. Now what we can do here is, let's quickly turn this off, is we can use the arpeggiator to randomly select one of those notes for every 16 note. And in fact, by default, my arpeggiator actually loads up like that. You can see that we have random others selected and a rate of 1/16. So it's just going to pick one random note out of all of the notes that we have the possibility to trigger, which again is just going to be all of the notes, which some of them are silent and others are going to be individual vocal chops. But you can hear that the pitches are all over the place. That is, of course, the nice thing about a vocal, is that it's a constantly kind of morphing idea, and that the pitch is going up and it's going down. So that is really going to give us a whole range of different textures and all of that kind of stuff. But we still want it to be tuned to the key of our track. So in order to do that, I like to use a little trick, or not really a trick, this is just what the effect does, which is the spectral resonator. What we can do here is we can tie this to the key, and therefore we can have all of these sounds resonate in the key of our track. In this case, the track that I'm writing is actually in F, and now we can set the decay to really just introduce that key tonality into the sound a little bit, but not overextend it. We can also try an octave higher. But I like the lower octave more. And what I also like to do is set the unison over here to 2 voices, and then just a slight bit of detune so that we get the stereo effect. And really that is what is at the basis of both of these sounds. So now if we go back into the patches, you'll see something very, very similar. We have a vocal that I've chopped up in some way. We then have a spectral resonator and then some more processing to really bring out the sound. So in this case, an OTT, some EQing, and then finally a delay. But you'll also see that we have these two automations over here, and that is really something special that you can do with the spectral resonator, in that you can both shift and stretch the incoming signal. So that is what allows us to have like a changing tonality to the sound over time. Oh, hey, sorry guys, just wanted to say if you do find this kind of stuff difficult to make, you can just get both of the Ableton tracks on my Patreon page and you don't even have to set up anything. You can just drop them into your project. So if you're interested in that and you want to support the channel at the same time, that is a great way of doing it. And the cool thing about the stretching and the shifting is that they change the tonality in different ways. So we already have like a fairly complex signal going into it, in the sense that we're generating all of these different vocals and they can be randomly appearing at any given time. But we're making it even more complex by kind of changing the pitch of the sound in two different ways. So sometimes they're working together, sometimes they're kind of doing the opposite of each other. And this is where you can, of course, be really creative with the kind of movement that you're trying to get out of the sound. So this is really one of the areas where you can experiment. Other than that, of course, there's not much more going on. We just have the most basic form of processing over here. You may see something interesting though in the MIDI, in that there's like a little gap over here that is filled in over here. That is actually deliberate, because with these gaps, what you'll see is that there's no lower notes over here. But if I go into this MIDI clip, you'll see that we have the slices and then there's some more lower notes over here. So what you can actually do is you can determine the amount of times that it actually triggers versus the amount of times that you're going to get silence by removing notes from these areas over here. So this is going to be denser than this part over here because there's more silent notes in this part. Now, sometimes, of course, you don't want these very sparse sequences where there's a lot of silence in between. So in those cases, we have this sound over here. Which you can see in this case only have one area of silence. And even this I would probably just completely get rid of in a sound like this, because now we just have the slices in here and therefore it's always going to trigger a vocal. In this case, it is very similar. We're just going to look at the differences in the processing, but you'll see that the starting position is very like the same in the idea that we're doing, in that we're just chopping up the vocal. I did change some of these parameters around, I believe. This is, of course, where you're going to be able to dial in the envelope of all of the sounds. But don't think too much of that, because this envelope is actually going to be imprinted on top of the envelope that it already has. You can imagine that different areas of this vocal are going to have like different volumes at different points of time. You can actually see that in the waveform. So this attack, decay, sustain, and release doesn't actually change any of that and just imprints it on top of it. So that is why you sometimes hear sounds that kind of slide in, and sometimes you hear sounds that really are like starting plucky and then they immediately stop, and sometimes they're a little bit more sustained overall. But in general, this is a nice way to dial in at least, say, some of the release with this gate over here, for example. Do you want it nicely releasing into each other, or do you want it really staccato? Of course, will really depend on the type of sound that you're trying to go for here. But after that, as you can see, again, the processing is very, very similar. We have an OTT and an EQ over here, again, for some low frequency removal. And then we have M stereo spread over here. This is to generate the stereo effect on the vocals. As you can imagine, all of these samples are mono. So you want to introduce a little bit of stereo wave into them. And we're doing that in this case with the M stereo spread, as well as the spectral resonator over here, which is a little later in the chain. Before that, we have the saturator, which is just adding a little bit of extra grid to the sound. You can see I'm not even boosting it into it or clipping it in any way. We're just using this for the analog clip like transfer curve that is in here. And then it goes into the spectral resonator, which is again just set there for mainly tuning. In this case, we're not even using the stretch and shift functionality, so it's always staying in key. And then you can see we have the two voice of unison for the stereo effect. So we're really trying to get the tonality out of there and get a nice warm stereo sound out of it. Finally, a little bit more EQing. This is the one that is responsible for the filtering in of the idea. So that is what you'll see over here. You can see this filter going up over time. And then finally, we have the delay over here. This is just some residue left from the actual production of the track. So I can delete this automation because it's not really necessary for the sound, because we're just delaying the sound out over time, as you can see. So that is really all there is to these kind of sounds. As you can imagine, the starting points that you start off with is going to be very important. So you're going to get different textures and different tonalities out of the different vocals that you end up using. So this is just very fun to experiment with and just trying out different vocals, seeing what kind of tonality that you get out of it. And then with just the basic processing that we get inside of Ableton, we're able to get some really nice sounds out of that. Of course, each DAW is going to have a way to chop up vocals. I believe there's like a slice menu somewhere inside of FL Studio, but I'm sure other DAWs have a very similar thing because it's a very popular technique. So just experiment around with what your DAW has to offer in that regard. And of course, it is always a good idea to retune them to the key of your track. In our case, Spectral Resonator is really good for that, but you can also use other tools. Something like an autotuner works really well in that, and that is something that I've used before as well. But you can also create your own resonators using a simple delay, where you divide 1000 by the frequency that you want to have, and then you get a millisecond amount that you can set up as the delay time, and you give it a little bit of feedback to get that resonating tone out of it. So that's going to be it for today. I hope that you enjoyed it. Let me know if you did by leaving a like, and make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my content, so I'll leave 2 videos up on the screen for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.